Hello, welcome back again. Since last video we are discussing about the for loop, and if you happen to watch this video, then I highly recommend you to first refer to my earlier video. In that video I explained you the structure of the for loop, how it works and all those intricacies, and then come back to this video. Are new to the for loop structure, then this video will not going to make any sense to you, and that would be a wastage of your time. Okay, so I highly recommend you to watch my earlier video. So this is the session agenda for this video. So we are going to discuss about a loop structure, a nested loop structure, where you have multiple for loops working together. That means you have a multiple loop index and loop vectors, and they work together. There is a strong interplay of these vectors and indexes, and then it gives you the output. So it's quite a complicated structure we have here, the nested loop structure. We are going to see that, and of course we are going to elaborate more with the help of example in R. So let's get started and let's try to decipher how the nested loop structure looks like. So this is how the nested loop structure, for loop structure looks like. As you can see, there are two for loops, but this big for loop, so this is the opening curly bracket and this is the closing curly bracket, it's called as a outer for loop. Outer for loop. And there is one for loop which is hidden inside this outer for loop, which is this one. This is the opening bracket and the closing one for the inner for loop. So this is called as a inner for loop. Okay, and they are nested together. The inner for loop is nested inside the outer for loop. Okay, that's why it is called as a nested for loop, right? And there is another important thing that you need to look for, is there is a different loop counters. Can you observe it? There is a loop counter I used for the outer loop, and there is a separate loop counter J used for the inner loop. Okay, so let me write this thing to you. So different loop counters you have for each of the loop, and you have a different loop vectors, right? You have different loop counters and different loop vectors for each of the loop. That is very important. It's going to only work if you use different counters and different loop vectors. Okay, otherwise you will be shown the error. Okay, now having understood this basic structure of the nested for loop, let me take an example and let me show you a step by step how exactly this thing works. Okay, so let's go to the example. So let's see the example of nested for loop. Okay, so here I have created a matrix, a simple 2 by 2 matrix called X. Remember that this matrix will be filled by rows and not by columns. So X will look like X 1, 2, 3 and 4. Okay, simple 2 by 2 matrix. And then I have used a nested for loops. So this is the outer for loop, this one is the outer for loop, and this one is the inner for loop. Okay, now let me first tell you what this small function that you see, sequence length function, is all about. Sequence length number is how the structure of this sequence length function is. And what it does is that this sequence length function, it creates a sequence of numbers, okay, and that sequence starts with 1 and with step of 1. Okay, so this sequence starts with 1 with the step of 1 finishes at the number value. So sequence length of 5 will create 5 numbers starting from 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 ending to 5, and each number will get incremented by 1. Okay, this is how the sequence length works. Now coming back to our example, what will happen here is that it's going to create a sequence of 2 numbers. So I in this case will be a vector of 2 numbers because number of rows in this case is 2. Similarly, j will also be a vector of 2 numbers because number of columns are also 2, number of rows are also 2. Okay, so I and j will be a vector of 2 numbers. And then what's going to happen here with the print? So let's try to understand that. Now let me create a small table for you. So this is the table that I've created that will help you understand how exactly it works. So on first iteration, the value of I will be initiated to 1. The value of j will be initiated to 1. Okay. And then it will go inside the for loop, inside the nested for loop, in a for loop, and it will print the value of x. So x in this case will be 1, 1. Okay, what will be the value of 1, 1? X 1, 1 is this 1, number 1. So this will get printed. Now the thing to look after. Now here what's going to happen is that the value of I will be 1, but value of j is now going to get incremented. Okay, so the value of j will be 2 and print value of x in this case will be 1, 2. So what is the value of 1, 2? It's 2. Now remember this thing, once the entire inner loop, okay, once the entire inner loop gets executed, then the counter for the outer loop will get incremented. Okay, in this case all the iteration of the inner loop has taken place. So in the third iteration, what's going to happen is, in the third iteration, the value of I will be 2. Okay, again it will come to the inner loop, the value of j will be reset again. Value of j will be reset again. So the value of j will be 1. Print in this case will be x 2, 1. The value will be 3. Okay. Then after the third iteration, the value of j will become 2 and the value of x will be 2, 2. It will be 4. And after this iteration, the inner loop will exit, it will go back to the outer loop, but the outer loop, the counter has reached to the end position, the outer loop counter has reached to the end position, and therefore it will not go back into the inner loop, and the entire nested for loop will exit. Okay, so if I sum it up, the execution of nested for loop happens inside out. Okay, you have outer for loop, you have inner loop, and this inner loop will get incremented till the inner loop counter reaches to its last position. Once inner loop counter reaches to its last position, then the counter for the outer loop will get incremented. Okay, and then again the for loop will enter into an inner loop, and the loop repeats till the outer loop counter gets to its last position. That's why I said that it is inside out. Inner loop will work all the way, and then it will go to the outer loop. This is how the nested loop for loop gets executed. So now let's see the example in R. Let's open the R session. So this is a for loop, nested for loop. This is the example that we have discussed. So let me run this example. As you can see that this is the X, matrix X, 2 by 2 matrix, and this is the output of the nested for loop 1, 2, 3, 4, and how it got derived we have seen it step by step in our explanation. Okay, now let me show you another interesting example. This example I've created two vectors, loop vector 1 and loop vector 2. Loop vector 1 starting from the value of 5 all the way till 7, 5, 6, 7. Loop vector 2, I am filling that vector in a reverse order, starting from 9 ending to 6, 9, 7, 9, 8, 7, 6, like that. Okay, so I've created these two vectors, and I am creating a matrix called my matrix. I'm using the values of these two vectors, the length of these two vectors as the column and row dimension of the matrix, and initially I am filling the matrix with innes. Okay, with inne. Now I want to fill in the matrix. I want to replace all the values of the matrix with the values of loop vector and loop vector 2, loop vector 1 and loop vector 2. So that's what I want to do. So I am using the nested for loop. Outer for loop is having a loop index I, inner for loop having a loop index j. Outer for loop I am initiating with a length of the loop vector 1. Inner for loop I am initiating with the length of the vector 2. And then once it comes inside the inner for loop, depending upon the position of the counter or the position of the index of inner and outer for loops, the matrix will get, my matrix will get filled, the value of the my matrix will get filled up by the multiplication of these two vectors, loop vector 1 and loop vector 2. Okay, so if I execute this, then this is how the matrix will look like. Initially the matrix is filled with all the NAs with 4 columns and 3 rows. Okay, and once I execute the nested for loop, each of the value will get multiplied. Each of the value inside the matrix will be the multiplication of these two vectors, loop vector 1 and loop vector 2. So let's see this first row, how this first row is derived. So when the for loop gets initiated, the value of I, which is a loop index for the outer vector, outer for loop, will be 1, value of j, which is a loop index for the inner for loop, will be 1. So the first element of the loop vector will be multiplied by the first element of the loop vector 2. So what is the first element of the loop vector 1 is 5. What is the first element of the loop vector 2 is 9. So 9 5s are 45. So here you go. That's 45. And one thing that we have learned is that the inner for loop will get repeated till it reaches to its last counter position. So in this case, the inner for loop will get repeated 4 times because length of the vector 2 is 4. Okay, so in the second iteration, the loop index value will be 2. It will then point at the second value of the loop vector 2. Remember, the value of I is still 1. So loop vector 1 value will be a constant, that is 5. But loop vector 2 values will going to change. In the second iteration, it is now going to change from 9 to 8. The two values will get multiplied together. That means 8 into 5, that is 40. In the third iteration of the inner for loop, the value of the loop vector 2 will become 7. 7 will get multiplied by 5, that is 35. And the fourth iteration, the value 6 will get multiplied by 5, that is 30. Now the inner for loop has reached to its last position of the counter. It will exit and it will go out, and the counter for the outer for loop now will get incremented. That means the value of I in this case will be 2. Okay, so it will point at second value of the loop vector 1, which is 6. Similarly, now each value of the second vector, loop vector 2, will now get multiplied by 6. That is what is showing in the second row. 9 6s are 54, 8 6s are 48, then 7 6s are 42, and 6 6s are 36. In a similar manner, the last row of the matrix will get filled with the multiplication of the two vectors. So this is how the nested for loop works. So let's quickly recap what we have learned in this video. We started this video by understanding the structure of nested for loop. Then we went into the nitty-gritties of how this nested for loop works. Finally, we saw the example and we ran the R code. So that's it, friends. If you feel that you are liking these videos and actually getting the value out of it, then you may like to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Infinity channel for data science. You can also hit the bell button so that you can get the immediate notifications as soon as I post the videos on the YouTube. Bye bye and take care. See you soon.